Hi, this video is part of my complete Docker and Kubernetes course. The link is in the description of the video, so make sure to give a thumbs up, and if you don't want to miss any updates, subscribe to the channel. That being said, let's get started. Hello and welcome back. Let's now continue with the setup of our application, and we already have something up and running for our notebooks backend. Let's then focus on our nodes backend. The setup of our nodes backend will be very similar to the notebooks backend, so we're just gonna copy paste a couple of files here and make some small adjustments. I'm gonna take the docker file.dev, the compose, the .env, and the docker ignore. I'm gonna copy this here, and I'm gonna paste inside of our nodes backend folder. We will also copy the dbconfig folder and we will paste again inside of our nodes backend folder. Let me expand the side a little bit so that we can see it a little bit better. Basically, the structure of these two folders is exactly the same. We have dbconfig with our Mongo init script inside of it. We also have our source folder that's here. And then we have 4 files that are used by Docker Compose, namely the docker ignore, the .env, the compose.yaml, and the dockerfile.dev for us to be able to build and run our project locally. Let's then make a couple of adjustments to our files here. The Docker file stays the same because the project structure is the same. The compose file will be the one that will change primarily here. So we'll say that this will be the nodes backend. We will have a nodes service, and the build context is the same. It's the current folder, and the Docker file is the dockerfile.dev. The port here that we would like to map, this is slightly important. If we were to run these two projects side by side, we're going to have an impact. We're going to have a conflict because the port 3000 of localhost will be allocated to whatever project starts first. So we can either leave the port 3000 for the notebooks backend as we already did and map the port 3001 here of our localhost, or we could do it the other way around. I'm just going to leave it as it is because the ports here we are just using for some intermediary checks. We are going to get rid of these ports here in our final setup. The DB URL will change slightly. Now we're going to use the nodes DB user environment variable. We'll also use the nodes DB password here, and we're going to connect to the nodes DB database, so nodes DB, and we'll use the nodes DB name like so. The develop stays the same since the folder structure here is the same. For our networks, we'll then use the nodes-net here, and this will depend on the nodes DB instead of notebooks. So let me just rename also the notebooks DB to nodes DB. The env file stays the same. The volumes here will change. So now we will have nodes-data instead of notebooks-data. And the bind volume, the bind amount here will stay the same because the relative path, the dbconfig/mongo init, is the same. And the target here is also the same. The networks here will change to nodes-net, and then we will have here just nodes-data and nodes-net like so. Perfect. Now from within our .env file, we're going to just leave the root username and the root password to be the same. We're just going to change the notebooks DB user to nodes DB user, nodes DB password, and nodes DB name. And then we'll just say here nodes_user, nodes_password, and then we'll say nodes DB like so. The last thing we need to do is inside of our dbconfig folder, let's open our mongo init.js, and let's just do a search and replace here. Let's copy notebooks, let's search in our IDE, and in VS Code, I just need to click here and then I can replace notebooks with nodes. I would like to identify or to at least map this here or mark this as case sensitive because there are a few things that I don't want to replace here. So let's replace one by one. We're just seeing here that on the screen this is being replaced and that is looking good. Let's now go for notebooks and then we'll just change this with nodes with a capital N. And then we have also notebooks here and we'll just change this with capital letters nodes. 1, 2, 3, perfect. And really, that's all we need to do, and we have already our project set up here. We did not update the code inside of our server.js file, so let's do the same here. We're just gonna copy the code from here. We're gonna paste inside of our server.js. Let's copy everything here. Let's remove this code and paste the new one. Let's then have a look at the things we need to change, and primarily here we just need to change from notebooks to notes. The port here will stay the same because once again, the port that we are specifying in our compose file, this is the port that the container will listen to, or basically that our node or our Express server will be listening for requests. However, to avoid conflicts, the important one is the port that we map in our local host. Once again, this is needed only if we want to access this service directly from our host network, because if we are communicating between containers, then we don't really need to expose these ports here. So later on, as I already mentioned, we can get rid of this, or we will be able to get rid of this once we have our reverse proxy in place. Let's come to the file here. Let's just have a look whether there is something else we need to change. There is a notebooks here, so let's just change the node server listening on port and then this port here. Let's save this, and now let's jump to the terminal and let's see whether we can just quickly run a Docker compose up and test whether this setup here is working. In the terminal, let's change into our nodes backend and let's simply run docker compose up -- build like so. You can also use the -- watch, test whether the watch functionality is working. After a couple of seconds, we're just going to install all the dependencies. And as you will see here, we already start getting the messages that both our database is up as well as our nodes backend. Let's then quickly jump to Postman and let's try to send a GET request to the port 3001 of our local host. The moment we do that, we get back hello from nodes, which is exactly what we expected. Back in our terminal, we can now split this into two terminals. And if we change into our notebooks backend here, we can simply run a docker compose up once again. We can also use both the build and the watch flags. And you will see here that we actually also get connected to MongoDB, starting server, notebook server listening on port 80. Coming to our Postman interface here, we can also send a GET request to port 3000. So now basically we have the notebook server running on port 3000 and the nodes backend, the node server running on port 3001. Congratulations, we have achieved a great deal already by Dockerizing both our notebooks backend and our nodes backend. As you can see here, the configuration is very similar between these two because these are two Express projects. They're very similar between each other, but we were able to achieve a state where we can quickly spin up the notebooks backend service together with the necessary database. And here you can think of also that we could include a caching, for example, if we wish to do so. So it's very easy to extend this configuration to spin up other containers for us to continue the development of our application. The same thing goes to the nodes backend, and all we had to do is create its own compose file with the correct configuration. Perfect, that is a great moment for us to take a short break and come back in the next lecture.